Some secrets are buried so deep that even time can't erase them. For 73 years, I've carried a weight that no child should ever bear, a darkness that shaped every decision I've made, every relationship I've built, and every moment I've lived. My name is Patricia, I'm 81 years old now, and this is the first time I'm speaking these words out loud. They say the truth will set you free, but what they don't tell you is how much it hurts to dig it up from where you've buried it. I've spent decades convincing myself that what happened in that little house in Michigan was just a bad dream, that the little girl who lived through those horrors was someone else entirely. But she wasn't someone else, she was me, and her story, my story, needs to be told. If even one person hears what I'm about to share and finds the courage to speak up, to protect a child, or to break free from their own silence, then perhaps these scars will finally serve a purpose beyond reminding me of what I survived. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Patricia Lynn Foster in the spring of 1943, in a small industrial town called Riverside, Michigan. The war was raging across the ocean, but in our little corner of America, life moved at the steady rhythm of factory whistles and Sunday church bells. Our house sat on Maple Street, a narrow two-story building with peeling white paint and a front porch that creaked whenever the wind picked up. It wasn't much to look at, but to me, it was the entire world. My earliest memories are painted in the soft colors of my mother's presence. Ruth Foster was barely 22 when I was born, but she carried herself with the quiet strength that seemed to run in the women of our family. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight streaming through our kitchen window, and hands that always smelled like the lavender soap she made herself. In those early years, before everything changed, she would hum while she cooked, little melodies that had no names but filled our house with something that felt like safety. My father, William Foster, was a machinist at the Ford plant downtown. He was a tall, gentle man with calloused hands and eyes the color of storm clouds. I remember sitting on his lap in the evenings, feeling the scratch of his work shirt against my cheek as he read to me from a worn copy of fairy tales. He had a deep voice that made even the scariest stories feel safe, and when he laughed, which was often in those days, it was a sound that could chase away any shadow. Our life was simple but rich in the ways that mattered. Sunday mornings meant pancakes shaped like animals, afternoon walks to the corner store for penny candy, and bedtime stories that always ended with the promise that tomorrow would bring new adventures. I believed, with the absolute certainty that only a child can possess, that this was how life would always be. The war felt distant then, something that existed only in the worried conversations my parents had in hushed tones after they thought I was asleep. But war has a way of reaching into the safest places, and in the summer of 1947, when I was 4 years old, it finally reached our little house on Maple Street. I don't remember the day the telegram came, but I remember the sound my mother made when she read it, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to steal all the air from the room. I remember the way she sank into the kitchen chair, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes staring at something I couldn't see. Most of all, I remember the silence that followed, thick and heavy like a blanket that threatened to smother everything good in our world. William Foster had been called to serve his country, and within 2 weeks, he was gone. I stood at the living room window, pressing my small hands against the glass, watching him walk down Maple Street with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He turned back once to wave, and I waved back so hard my whole body shook. I thought he was going on an adventure, like the heroes in his stories. I thought he would come back with tales to tell and presents in his pockets. AC Turkloezy Bentries, he never came back. The notification came on a gray October morning in 1948. I was 5 then, old enough to understand that something terrible had happened but too young to grasp the permanence of it. My mother's sister, Aunt Beverly, had come to stay with us for a few days, and I remember hiding behind the kitchen door, listening to them talk in voices that sounded hollow and strange. "He died a hero," Aunt Beverly kept saying, as if repeating it would somehow make the words less sharp. "Fighting for freedom, for democracy, for—" "He died," my mother interrupted, her voice flat and empty. "Everything else is just words." In the months that followed, Our house began to change in ways that my 5-year-old mind couldn't quite understand. The humming stopped first. Then the pancakes shaped like animals became just pancakes, and eventually just toast. The bedtime stories grew shorter, then disappeared altogether. My mother still took care of me, still made sure I was fed and clean and safe. But it was as if someone had dimmed a light inside her that I didn't know how to turn back on. She took a job at the textile factory across town, working long shifts that started before dawn and ended well after dark. Mrs. Sullivan, an elderly widow from down the street, would come to watch me during the day. She was kind but distant, treating me with the careful politeness reserved for someone else's responsibility. I spent those long days playing alone in our small backyard, making up elaborate games and conversations with imaginary friends who filled the silence my father had left behind. It was during this lonely period that I learned to be content with my own company, to find comfort in the small rituals that connected me to happier times. I would sit in my father's chair, which still smelled faintly of his aftershave, and read aloud from the fairy tale book, trying to make my voice sound like his. I would help my mother with simple household tasks, standing on a wooden stool to reach the sink, desperate to bring back some of the warmth that had once filled our home. For nearly 2 years, it was just the two of us against the world. My mother worked herself to exhaustion, coming home each night with shoulders that seemed to carry more weight than they were built for. I learned to recognize the signs of her particularly hard days. The way she would stand in the doorway for a moment before entering, as if gathering strength to face even the comfort of home. On those nights, I would already have my pajamas on and my teeth brushed, trying to be as little trouble as possible. But despite the sadness that had settled over our house like dust, there was still love there. Quiet love, careful love, but love nonetheless. My mother would still check on me before she went to sleep, still smooth my hair away from my forehead and whisper that she loved me. In the mornings, she would pack my lunch with small notes tucked inside, simple drawings of flowers or hearts that reminded me I wasn't forgotten. I thought this was how we would always be, careful and quiet in making do with the love we had left. I thought the hardest part of our story was already over. I was wrong. It was in the spring of 1950, just after my 7th birthday, that my mother began to mention a name I'd never heard before. Mr. Harrison, she would say, always formal, always careful. A man from work. At first, these mentions were casual, almost accidental. Mr. Harrison showed me a better way to organize the inventory sheets. Mr. Harrison walked me to the bus stop because it was raining. But gradually, I began to notice changes in my mother when she spoke about him. Her voice would soften slightly, and sometimes, just sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of something in her eyes that reminded me of the woman she had been before the telegram came. She started taking more care with her appearance, pinning her hair in styles she hadn't worn since my father left. She bought a new dress, navy blue with small white flowers, and wore it to church on Sundays even though we hadn't attended regularly since my father's death. I was curious about this Mr. Harrison who seemed to have such an effect on my mother, but I was also wary. At 7 years old, I had a child's protective instinct toward the fragile stability we had built. Our quiet life wasn't happy, exactly, but it was ours, and I wasn't sure I wanted anyone else to disturb it. When my mother finally told me that Mr. Harrison would be coming to dinner on a Sunday afternoon in May, I felt something twist in my stomach that I didn't have words for. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't excitement either. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something unknown, looking down into darkness and wondering if the ground would hold when you finally took that first step. "He's a good man, Patricia," my mother said, kneeling in front of me and taking my small hands in her work-roughened ones. "I think you'll like him. I think he could be good for both of us." I nodded because that's what good daughters did, but inside, a voice I was too young to understand was whispering warnings I was too innocent to heed. Change was coming to our little house on Maple Street, and despite my mother's hopeful words, I couldn't shake the feeling that not all changes were good ones. The foundation of my childhood, already cracked by loss and loneliness, was about to be tested in ways that would reshape everything I thought I knew about safety, about trust, and about the adults who were supposed to protect the small and vulnerable. But that Sunday was still days away, and for a few more precious moments I could still believe that the worst thing that would ever happen to me had already passed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That Sunday afternoon in May arrived with the kind of perfection that makes you believe good things are possible. The sun streamed through our kitchen windows, casting golden rectangles across the freshly mopped linoleum floor. My mother had been preparing since dawn, baking her famous apple pie, polishing the good china we hadn't used since before my father left, and arranging wildflowers she'd picked from our neighbor's garden in a mason jar centerpiece. I watched her move around the kitchen with an energy I hadn't seen in years. She hummed, actually hummed, while she worked, and for brief moments, I caught glimpses of the woman she'd been when laughter came easily and the future seemed bright. She wore her new navy dress with the small white flowers, and she'd pinned her auburn hair in soft waves that framed her face. She looked younger somehow, as if hope itself had smoothed away some of the worry lines that had etched themselves around her eyes. "Patricia, sweetheart, could you set the table?" she asked, her voice carrying a nervous excitement that made my stomach flutter. "Use the good plates, the ones with the roses." I carefully arranged our finest dishes, wedding gifts that had sat unused in the cabinet for 3 years. Each piece felt precious and fragile in my 7-year-old hands, and I understood without being told that this meal was important in ways I couldn't quite grasp. As I placed the forks and knives in their proper positions, I found myself hoping that maybe, just maybe, this Mr. Harrison would bring back the mother I remembered from before the war stole everything good from our lives. The knock came at exactly 3 o'clock, sharp and confident. My mother smoothed her dress one final time, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and opened the door with a smile that seemed to illuminate our entire house. "Frank," she said, and even in that single word, I could hear something I hadn't heard in years: joy. Frank Harrison stepped into our living room, and I got my first real look at the man who had captured my mother's attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back with pomade and a mustache that reminded me of the movie stars in the magazines Mrs. Sullivan sometimes showed me. He wore a crisp white shirt and suspenders, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him seemed careful and deliberate, from the way he held his hat to the precise manner in which he wiped his feet on our doormat. "Ruth, you look absolutely beautiful," he said, taking my mother's hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that made her blush like a schoolgirl. "And this must be the famous Patricia I've heard so much about." He turned to me then, and I found myself looking up into eyes that were the color of winter ice, pale blue and somehow cold despite his warm smile. He extended his hand toward me, and I noticed how large it was, how it could easily engulf both of mine. "Hello, Patricia. Your mother has told me wonderful things about you. I hope we can be great friends." I shook his hand because it was what polite children did, but something about his grip, firm to the point of being uncomfortable, made me want to pull away quickly. When I tried to, he held on just a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a way that sent an odd shiver down my spine. "She's shy," my mother said quickly, her hand moving protectively to my shoulder. "Patricia, say hello to Mr. Harrison." "Hello, Mr. Harrison," I managed, my voice smaller than I intended. "Please, call me Frank," he said, finally releasing my hand. "We're going to be spending a lot of time together, I hope." Dinner began pleasantly enough. Frank complimented my mother's cooking with elaborate praise that made her beam with pride. He told stories about his work as a foreman at the steel mill, painting pictures of a world where men worked with molten metal and machines that could forge anything imaginable. He spoke about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about the farm where he'd grown up before the Depression forced his family to move to the industrial cities of Michigan. "I never had children of my own," he said at one point, his gaze settling on me with an intensity that made me fidget in my chair. "I always regretted that. There's something special about a house with a child's laughter in it." My mother reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Patricia is a wonderful girl. She's been so brave through everything we've been through." Sometimes I think she's wiser than her years." "I can see that," Frank said, and his smile seemed different somehow. Warmer on the surface, but with something underneath that I couldn't identify. Wise eyes. Old soul. "That's a gift, Patricia." I nodded and focused on cutting my meat into smaller and smaller pieces, uncomfortable with the way his attention seemed to settle on me like a weight. There was something in his voice when he spoke to me, a tone that was different from how he addressed my mother. Softer, more careful, as if he were speaking to something fragile that might break if handled roughly. After dinner, while my mother cleared the dishes, Frank asked if I would show him our backyard. "I hear you have quite a garden back there," he said. "I'd love to see what you and your mother have been growing." We stepped outside into the late afternoon sunlight, and Frank walked slowly around our small plot of vegetables and herbs. He asked questions about everything: which plants were mine to tend, where I liked to play, whether I had any special hiding spots where I went to think. His interest seemed genuine, and despite my earlier discomfort, I found myself warming to his attention. "You know, Patricia," he said, crouching down to my eye level beside my mother's tomato plants, "I think you and I are going to get along very well. I can tell you're the kind of girl who knows how to keep secrets." Something in the way he said secrets made my skin prickle, but before I could think about it too deeply, my mother appeared in the doorway, smiling at the sight of us together. "Are you two getting acquainted?" she called out. "Indeed we are," Frank replied, standing and placing his hand on my shoulder. "Patricia is even more delightful than you described, Ruth. You've raised a very special little girl." The weight of his hand seemed to burn through my dress, and I stepped slightly away, pretending to examine a butterfly that had landed on the marigolds. Frank's hand fell away, but I could feel his eyes following my movement. As the evening wore on, I began to notice small things that my mother, caught up in her happiness, seemed to miss. The way Frank's gaze would linger on me when he thought no one was looking. How he found excuses to brush past me in our narrow hallway, his hand briefly touching my arm or back. The way he positioned himself so that I had to squeeze between him and the furniture to reach my favorite spot on the sofa. The way When my mother went to the kitchen to prepare coffee, Frank sat down beside me on the couch, closer than seemed necessary in a room with plenty of space. "You know, Patricia," he said quietly, "I hope you'll think of me as a friend. Someone you can talk to about anything at all. Sometimes children need a special friend, someone who understands them in ways that even their mothers might not." I nodded because I didn't know what else to do, but something about the way he spoke, the careful tone, the emphasis on words like special and anything, made me think of the warnings Mrs. Sullivan had given me about talking to strangers. But Frank wasn't a stranger anymore, was he? He was my mother's friend, maybe more than a friend, and that made him safe, didn't it? "I can see you're a smart girl," he continued, his voice so low that my mother wouldn't have been able to hear it from the kitchen even if she'd been listening. "Smart girls know that some conversations are just between friends. Private conversations. Do you understand what I mean?" I wasn't sure I did, but I nodded anyway because his pale blue eyes seemed to be waiting for an answer, and something about disappointing him felt dangerous, in a way I couldn't explain. "Good," he said, and his hand briefly touched my knee before my mother's footsteps announced her return. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of adult conversation about topics that didn't interest me: work schedules, neighborhood gossip, plans for upcoming church socials. I curled up in the corner of the sofa with a book, trying to focus on the adventures of Nancy Drew, but I found myself stealing glances at Frank, studying his profile as he talked and laughed with my mother. He was handsome, I supposed, in the way that movie stars were handsome, all sharp angles and confident gestures, and he clearly made my mother happy. She laughed more during that single evening than she had in the entire previous year. When she looked at him, her eyes sparkled with something that I was too young to name, but old enough to recognize as important. So why did I feel so unsettled? When Frank finally prepared to leave, my mother walked him to the front porch while I pretended to read in the living room. Through the open window I could hear the murmur of their voices, low and intimate. There was a long silence, and then my mother's soft laughter, the kind that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside her chest. When she came back inside, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes bright with happiness. "Did you like him, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting down beside me and smoothing my hair away from my face. I wanted to say yes because I could see how much my answer mattered to her. I wanted to be happy that she was happy, to embrace this change that had brought light back into her eyes. But there was something, some instinct I couldn't name, that made the words stick in my throat. "He seems nice," I said finally, which wasn't quite a lie, but wasn't quite the truth either. "He is nice," my mother said firmly, as if saying it with enough conviction could make it absolutely true. "He's going to be good for us, Patricia. For both of us. I can feel it." She kissed my forehead and sent me upstairs to get ready for bed, humming softly as she began to tidy up the remnants of our special dinner. As I brushed my teeth and changed into my nightgown, I tried to convince myself that the strange feelings Frank had stirred in me were just the normal discomfort of meeting someone new, someone who might change the careful balance of our small family. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to my mother move around downstairs with a lightness in her step that I hadn't heard in years, I couldn't shake the memory of Frank's ice blue eyes or the way his hand had felt on my shoulder, heavy and warm and somehow possessive. I told myself I was being silly, that 7-year-old girls sometimes imagined things that weren't really there. My mother was happy, and that was what mattered. If Frank Harrison could give her back the joy that the war had stolen, then maybe the strange feelings he gave me were a small price to pay. I had no way of knowing then that some prices are far too high, and that the cost of my mother's happiness was about to become more than any child should ever be asked to bear. In the weeks that followed Frank's first visit, our house began to transform in ways both subtle and profound. What started as occasional Sunday dinners evolved into regular weeknight visits, then weekend stays that stretched longer each time. Frank had a way of making himself indispensable, fixing the squeaky hinge on our front door that had bothered my mother for months, replacing the burnt-out bulb in our porch light, and bringing home fresh fish from his weekend trips to Lake Huron. My mother bloomed under his attention like a flower that had been waiting years for the right amount of sunlight. She began wearing lipstick again, even on ordinary Tuesday mornings. She hummed while she cooked, and actually smiled when she came home from her long shifts at the textile factory. For the first time since my father's death, she seemed to believe that happiness was something she deserved, rather than something she had lost forever. "Frank brought us ice cream," she would announce on the evenings he visited, her voice carrying the same excitement I remembered from my earliest childhood memories. The good kind, from Peterson's Creamery. And it was good ice cream. Vanilla bean with real specks of vanilla, strawberry that tasted like summer itself. Frank would scoop generous portions into our best bowls, the ones with the hand-painted cherries that had been my grandmother's, and we would sit at our kitchen table like the family I had sometimes dreamed we might become again. But even during these sweet moments, I found myself studying Frank's face, searching for clues to the puzzle I couldn't quite solve. He was attentive and generous, patient with my mother's nervous chatter about her day at the factory, and genuinely interested in the small details of our lives. Yet there was something in the way he watched me, a focus that felt different from normal adult attention. It was during his third week of regular visits that I first noticed how his behavior changed depending on who was in the room. When my mother was present, Frank was the perfect gentleman, charming, respectful, careful to maintain appropriate distance. But when she stepped away to answer the phone or fetch something from another room, his demeanor would shift in ways so subtle that I wondered if I was imagining them. "Patricia," he said one evening while my mother was in the basement retrieving preserved peaches from our pantry, "come sit closer. I want to show you something." He had been reading the newspaper at our kitchen table, and he patted his knee in invitation. Every instinct I possessed screamed against it, but I was 7 years old and had been raised to obey adults without question. I approached hesitantly, and he lifted me onto his lap with hands that lingered a moment too long on my waist. "See this article here?" he said, pointing to a story about a new bridge being built across the Detroit River. "This is the kind of work I do. Making things that last, things that bring people together." His arm encircled my waist as he spoke, and I could feel his breath warm against my ear. There was nothing overtly wrong with the gesture. Plenty of uncles and family friends had held children on their laps while showing them pictures or reading stories. But something about Frank's touch felt different, more possessive. as if he were claiming rather than simply holding. "You're such a bright girl," he murmured, his voice so low that my mother wouldn't have heard it, even if she'd been in the room. "I can tell you understand things that other children your age might not. That makes you very special, Patricia. Very special indeed." When my mother's footsteps echoed on the basement stairs, Frank's grip loosened immediately, and by the time she entered the kitchen, he was simply showing me the newspaper, like any concerned adult might do with an inquisitive child. "What are you two looking at?" my mother asked, setting the jar of peaches on the counter with a smile that suggested she found the scene heartwarming. "Just sharing some current events with this brilliant daughter of yours," Frank replied smoothly. "She's going to be a real scholar someday, mark my words." The compliment made my mother beam with pride, and I slipped off Frank's lap to help her open the peach jar, grateful for the excuse to put distance between myself and those pale blue eyes that seemed to see too much. As summer progressed, Frank's presence in our home became as regular as the morning newspaper delivery. He began keeping spare clothes in our hall closet, his shaving kit appeared in our bathroom, and his work boots took up permanent residence by our back door. My mother never officially announced that he was moving in, but gradually, imperceptibly, our two-person household became a three-person one. The change brought genuine improvements to our daily life. Frank contributed to the household expenses, which meant my mother could work fewer overtime shifts and spend more time at home. He fixed things that had been broken for years: the loose banister on our staircase, the kitchen window that had refused to open since the previous summer, the temperamental furnace that had made our winters miserable. Under his care, our house began to feel like a home again, rather than a place where we simply existed. But with each passing day, I became more aware of the complexity of Frank's personality. Around my mother, he was unfailingly considerate, bringing her flowers from the hardware store, listening patiently to her concerns about work, and treating her with a respect that made her stand taller and smile more freely. Yet when she wasn't watching, his attention toward me grew increasingly intense and uncomfortable. It started with compliments that felt too personal. "You're developing into quite a young lady," he would say when my mother was hanging laundry in the backyard. Or, "That dress brings out your eyes beautifully, Patricia. You're gonna be a real heartbreaker someday." These comments made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't articulate. I had no frame of reference for understanding why an adult man's observations about my appearance should feel so wrong, but my body seemed to know what my mind couldn't process. I found myself changing my clothes when I heard his car pull into our driveway, choosing loose sweaters and long pants even on the hottest summer days. The physical contact escalated gradually, so slowly that each individual incident could be dismissed as accidental or innocent. A hand on my back that lingered too long when he passed behind my chair at dinner. Fingers that brushed against mine when he handed me a glass of water, maintaining contact for several heartbeats longer than necessary. Hugs that pressed me against his body with an intensity that made my stomach lurch with confusion and fear. "Frank really cares about you," my mother observed one evening as we watched him repair a broken spoke on my bicycle wheel. "I can tell he's already thinking of you as his own daughter." I wanted to tell her that Frank's care felt different from fatherly affection, that there was something in his touch and his gaze that made me want to hide. But how could I explain feelings I didn't understand to a woman who was finally happy again? How could I put words to sensations that had no names in my 7-year-old vocabulary? Instead, I nodded and tried to smile, pushing down the growing dread that seemed to expand in my chest every time Frank looked at me with those ice blue eyes. The first time Frank was alone with me for an extended period came on a sweltering August afternoon when my mother was called in for an emergency shift at the factory. A machine had broken down, and they needed experienced workers to help meet a crucial deadline for a government contract. "I hate to leave you," my mother said, gathering her purse and work gloves with obvious reluctance, "but Frank will be here, and it's only for a few hours." "Don't worry about us," Frank assured her, his arm draped casually around my shoulders. "Patricia and I will find plenty to keep ourselves busy. Won't we, sweetheart?" The endearment made me flinch, but my mother was already hurrying toward the door, late for her shift and distracted by work concerns. She kissed my forehead quickly and promised to be back before dinner time. As soon as her footsteps faded down our front walk, I felt the atmosphere in our house change. Frank's smile became different. Wider, more predatory, as if he had been wearing a mask that he could finally remove. "Well, Patricia," he said, his voice carrying a note I had never heard before. "It looks like it's just you and me this afternoon. I think it's time we got to know each other better." The way he said better made every nerve in my body scream with alarm, but I was trapped by my own innocence, by the ingrained obedience that made questioning adult authority feel impossible. I was 7 years old, alone in the house with a man who had never technically done anything wrong, and I had no idea that predators often begin their work long before they strike. "Why don't you come sit with me on the sofa?" Frank suggested, settling himself in the center of our living room couch. "We can have a nice, private conversation. Just the two of us." I moved toward him because I didn't know I had the right to refuse, because I had been taught that good children did what adults told them to do. But with each step, the voice in my head that had been whispering warnings for weeks grew louder, more insistent. Something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. And there was nowhere to run. I sat on the edge of the sofa, as far from Frank as the small piece of furniture would allow, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The afternoon sun streamed through our living room windows, casting everything in a golden light that should have felt warm and safe. Instead, the silence between us seemed to pulse with something dark and threatening. Frank studied me for a long moment, his pale blue eyes moving across my face with an intensity that made my stomach twist into knots. He had removed his work shirt and sat in his undershirt, which clung to his broad chest in the summer heat. There was something different about him now that my mother was gone. Something unleashed that he had kept carefully hidden during all those family dinners and evening conversations. "You know, Patricia," he said finally, his voice softer than usual but somehow more menacing, "I've been very patient, very careful. Your mother thinks the world of me, doesn't she?" I nodded because it was true, and because I sensed that agreeing with him was safer than remaining silent. "That's because I've been good to her. Good to both of you. I fixed your house, brought you nice things, made your mother smile again." He leaned forward slightly, and I instinctively pressed myself deeper into the corner of the sofa. "But I think it's time you started showing me some appreciation for everything I've done." The way he said appreciation made my skin crawl, though I couldn't have explained why. At 7 years old, I understood that adults sometimes wanted thanks for their kindness, but something about Frank's expectation felt wrong in a way that made my throat tight with fear. "I am grateful," I whispered, my voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "Are you?" Frank's smile was cold and calculating. "Then come here and show me." He patted his lap, just as he had done in the kitchen weeks earlier. But this time there was no newspaper to look at, no innocent excuse for the contact. This time his intention was written clearly across his face, and even my young mind could recognize the hunger in his expression. I shook my head, the movement so small it was barely perceptible, but Frank noticed immediately. His smile vanished, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "That's not very nice, Patricia. After everything I've done for you and your mother, the least you can do is be friendly." His voice carried a warning that made my hands tremble. "You wouldn't want your mother to think you were being ungrateful, would you? Especially when she's so happy these days." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Frank was telling me that my behavior could affect my mother's happiness, that disappointing him might somehow hurt the woman who had finally found joy again after years of grief and struggle. At 7 years old, I already felt responsible for so much of my mother's emotional well-being. The idea that I might be the cause of her sadness again was almost unbearable. Slowly, reluctantly, I moved toward him. Frank's hands reached for me before I was fully within reach, lifting me onto his lap with a firmness that left no room for resistance. This time there was nothing gentle or fatherly about his touch. His hands settled on my waist with a possessiveness that made my entire body go rigid with fear. "That's better," he murmured, his breath hot against my ear. "See? That wasn't so difficult." One of his hands moved to stroke my hair, the gesture that might have seemed affectionate to an outside observer but felt invasive and wrong to me. His other hand remained on my waist, his thumb moving in small circles that made my skin feel like it was crawling with insects. "You're such a pretty little girl," Frank said, his voice taking on a quality I had never heard before, thick and strange, as if he were speaking through water. "So much prettier than your mother was at your age. I bet you're going to be a real beauty when you grow up." His hand moved from my hair to trace the outline of my face, his fingertips rough against my cheek. I wanted to pull away, to run from the room, to scream for help, but I was paralyzed by confusion and terror. This was Frank, the man who brought us ice cream and fixed our broken things. This was the man who made my mother laugh. How could the same person who showed such kindness to my mother be making me feel so frightened and small? "You know what pretty little girls do?" Frank asked, his hand now resting on my shoulder, his thumb brushing against my collarbone in a way that made me feel sick. "They learn to be nice to the men who take care of them. They learn to keep secrets. Can you keep a secret, Patricia?" I wanted to say no, wanted to tell him that I didn't want to keep any secrets, but his grip on my shoulder had tightened, and I could feel the strength in his hands, strength that could easily overpower a small child if she didn't cooperate. "Yes," I whispered, the word torn from my throat against my will. "Good girl," Frank said, and the approval in his voice made me feel dirty in ways I couldn't understand. "Because this is going to be our special secret, something just between you and me. Your mother doesn't need to know about our private time together. In fact, it would really upset her if she found out. She might even think you were lying, trying to cause trouble. You wouldn't want that, would you?" The manipulation was sophisticated beyond my ability to recognize it. But my body understood what my mind couldn't process. Frank was creating a trap made of guilt and fear, ensuring that even if I wanted to tell my mother what was happening, I would be too afraid of the consequences to speak. "Patricia seems troubled lately," Mrs. Coleman mentioned to my mother during a parent-teacher conference in October. "She's not participating in class discussions the way she used to, and she seems reluctant to interact with the other children. Is everything all right at home?" My mother, glowing with happiness from her relationship with Frank, dismissed these concerns easily. "Oh, she's just adjusting to having a man in the house again," she explained. "It's been just the two of us for so long. I think she's a little overwhelmed by all the positive changes in our lives." Mrs. Coleman accepted this explanation because it seemed reasonable, because my mother appeared so content and Frank seemed so respectable when he picked me up from school or attended parent events. They had no way of knowing that the positive changes my mother celebrated were the source of my withdrawal, that the man she saw as our salvation was the architect of my destruction. At home, Frank's demands became more frequent and more invasive. What had started as inappropriate touching evolved into sessions where he would make me participate in ways that filled me with shame and confusion. He taught me words I was too young to understand, showed me things that no child should ever see, and convinced me that my compliance was proof of my love for him and my mother. "If you really care about your mother's happiness," he would say during these encounters, "you'll do what I ask. You'll be a good girl and help me feel better. That's what families do. They help each other." The most insidious part of Frank's manipulation was the way he framed his abuse as my choice. He would present me with false options. "You can sit on my lap while we watch television, or you can go to your room and miss the show," that made me feel like a willing participant rather than a victim. He never held me down or used obvious force. Instead, he created circumstances where cooperation seemed like the only viable option. The physical abuse was horrific, but the psychological damage cut even deeper. Frank convinced me that I was different from other children, that I understood adult things they couldn't comprehend, that I was mature enough to handle situations that would overwhelm my peers. This twisted form of flattery made me feel simultaneously special and isolated, chosen and damned. I began to change in ways that went beyond my behavior at school. I stopped playing with my dolls, suddenly finding their innocence unbearable. I became hyper-aware of my body, ashamed of physical changes that were natural for a growing child, but that Frank had taught me to see as shameful and provocative. I learned to dress in layers, to hide beneath loose clothing, to make myself as invisible as possible. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of the house, terrified that Frank would appear in my doorway. The bedroom door that had once represented safety now felt like a flimsy barrier against an inevitable intrusion. I learned to sleep curled in the corner of my bed, my back against the wall, so that no one could approach me without my knowledge. The isolation was perhaps the most damaging aspect of my situation. Frank had effectively cut me off from any source of help or support. My mother was too happy to see clearly. My teacher's concerns were dismissed, and I had been convinced that speaking the truth would destroy the fragile stability of our household. I was alone with my secret, alone with my pain, alone with the growing understanding that this was simply my life now. Frank celebrated his success in small, cruel ways. He would smile at me across the dinner table, his pale blue eyes holding secrets that only I understood. He would pat my head in front of my mother, his touch carrying meanings that she couldn't perceive but that made my skin crawl with remembered violation. He would compliment my mother on how well-behaved I was, how mature I had become, how lucky they both were to have such a special little girl. "Patricia is growing up so fast," he would tell my mother, as I sat frozen at the kitchen table. "She's becoming quite the young lady. You should be proud of the daughter you've raised." My mother would beam with pride, never realizing that Frank's words carried a double meaning, that he was celebrating not my development as a person, but his success in corrupting my childhood innocence. By the time winter settled over our small Michigan town, the pattern was firmly established. Frank's abuse had become a regular part of my life, as predictable as the changing seasons. I had learned to dissociate during his attacks, to send my mind somewhere else while my body endured things no child should ever experience. I had become an expert at hiding my pain, at pretending that everything was normal even as my world crumbled around me. My mother beamed with happiness, pleased that her daughter and her boyfriend were bonding, completely unaware that she had just witnessed the first lie in what would become years of enforced silence. Frank smiled at me over the top of his newspaper, and I saw the triumph in his pale blue eyes. He had won this first battle, established the rules of our terrible new game. I was 7 years old, and I had already learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who need protecting from the truth. The foundation of my childhood had cracked beyond repair, and the worst part was that no one else could see the damage. The weeks following that first afternoon alone with Frank marked the beginning of a new and terrible chapter in my young life. What had happened on our living room sofa wasn't an isolated incident. It was a blueprint, a template that Frank would use again and again as he systematically destroyed my sense of safety and self-worth. My mother, oblivious to the darkness that had entered our home, continued to flourish under Frank's attention. She had begun talking about marriage, dropping hints about how wonderful it would be to have a real family again. She would catch my hand while we did dishes together and speak dreamily about the security Frank provided, the future he represented. "Isn't it wonderful, Patricia?" she would say, her eyes bright with hope. "Finally, things are working out for us. Finally, we have someone we can depend on." Each time she spoke this way, Frank's warning echoed in my mind. "If you tell anyone, I'll have to leave, and your mother will be all alone again. It will be your fault." The weight of this responsibility, protecting my mother's happiness by preserving my own suffering, was crushing for a 7-year-old to bear. Frank, meanwhile, had become a master of creating opportunities for us to be alone. He volunteered to watch me whenever my mother needed to run errands, work overtime, or attend her weekly quilting circle at the church. What my mother saw as generous helpfulness was actually Frank engineering the circumstances for his continued abuse. "You don't mind if Frank stays with Patricia while I'm at Mrs. Henderson's, do you, sweetheart?" my mother would ask, already reaching for her coat and purse. "He's so good with children, and I know you two enjoy spending time together." I learned to dread these moments. The sound of my mother's heels clicking down our front walk, the way Frank's demeanor would shift the moment her car disappeared around the corner. It was as if he became a different person entirely when we were alone, shedding the mask of kindness he wore for the world and revealing something predatory and hungry underneath. The abuse escalated gradually, each incident pushing the boundaries a little further than the last. Frank was careful never to cross too many lines at once, understanding instinctively that overwhelming a child could cause them to break completely and potentially expose his crimes. Instead, he conditioned me slowly, normalizing each level of violation before introducing the next. "This is just between us," became his constant refrain. "This is our special time together. This is what happens in real families, Patricia. This is how a man shows a little girl that she's important to him." He would position these encounters as privileges, as signs of my maturity and special status. "You're so much more grown up than other girls your age," he would tell me, as his hands wandered where they shouldn't. That's why I can trust you with grown-up secrets. That's why you're special. The psychological manipulation was as damaging as the physical abuse. Frank systematically destroyed my ability to trust my own instincts, to believe that I deserved protection, to understand that what was happening to me was wrong. He convinced me that I was complicit, that I wanted this attention, that I was somehow responsible for his behavior. School became my only refuge, though even there I felt marked and different from my classmates. I would sit in my second-grade classroom and watch the other children laugh and play with an innocence I felt I had lost forever. Their problems, forgotten homework, playground disputes, crushes on boys in the upper grades, seemed impossibly trivial compared to the dark secret I carried. Mrs. Coleman, my teacher, began to notice changes in my behavior. I had always been a bright, engaged student, but suddenly I was withdrawn and distracted. My grades didn't suffer. If anything, I threw myself into schoolwork as an escape, but the light in my eyes had dimmed in ways that concerned the adults around me. The 7-year-old girl who had once believed in fairy tale endings and trusted adults to protect her was gone, replaced by someone older and sadder and infinitely more careful. I had learned that the monsters weren't hiding under the bed. Sometimes they sat at the dinner table, fixed broken appliances, and made your mother smile. And sometimes, the people who were supposed to save you were too blinded by their own happiness to see that you were drowning right in front of them. The winter of 1951 was particularly harsh in Riverside, Michigan. Snow piled against our windows in drifts that blocked out the light, and the wind howled through the gaps in our old house with a sound that seemed to echo the growing emptiness inside me. I had just turned 8 years old, but I felt ancient, carrying secrets that aged me far beyond my years. It was during this bleak season that someone finally noticed what everyone else had missed. Her name was Miss Eleanor Fitzgerald, and she was unlike any adult I had encountered before. She had come to Riverside as part of a new program from the county, visiting schools to check on children's welfare during the difficult post-war years. Where other adults seemed to look through me or past me, Miss Fitzgerald looked directly into my eyes with an intensity that was both frightening and hopeful. She appeared in our classroom on a Tuesday morning in January, introduced by our principal as someone who was there to, quote, make sure all our students were healthy and happy. Miss Fitzgerald was a tall, willowy woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She wore a practical woolen coat and carried a leather satchel that looked like it had traveled many miles and seen many things. I'll be speaking with each of you individually, she announced to our class, her voice carrying an authority that made even the most disruptive students sit up straight. Just a friendly conversation to see how you're all doing. When my turn came, I followed Miss Fitzgerald to a small, unused classroom at the end of the hall. She gestured for me to sit across from her at a child-sized table, and I noticed how she positioned herself at my eye level rather than towering above me like most adults did. Patricia Foster, she said, consulting a manila folder. 8 years old, excellent grades, lives with her mother and, she paused, looking at me carefully, her mother's friend, Mr. Harrison. The way she said friend suggested she understood more about family arrangements than the simple words conveyed. I nodded, unsure of what response was expected. Tell me about your family, Patricia, Miss Fitzgerald said, her voice gentle but somehow probing. What's it like at home? The question was simple, but it felt like a trap. Frank's warnings echoed in my mind. The threats about what would happen if I ever told anyone our secrets. The reminders that my mother's happiness depended on my silence. I gave the rehearsed answer I had perfected over months of practice. It's good, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother is happy. Frank, Mr. Harrison, takes good care of us. Miss Fitzgerald nodded, but her eyes never left my face. That's wonderful, dear. And how do you feel about Mr. Harrison living in your home? The question caught me off guard. No adult had ever asked me how I felt about Frank's presence. They had asked if I liked him, if I was grateful for his help, if I was behaving well for him. But no one had ever simply asked how I felt. I I started, then stopped, struggling to find words that wouldn't betray the terrible secrets I carried. He makes my mother happy. That's not what I asked, Patricia, Miss Fitzgerald said softly. I asked how you feel about him. There was something in her tone, patient, knowing, safe, that made the carefully constructed walls around my emotions crack just slightly. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to tell her everything, to pour out all the fear and confusion and shame that I had been carrying alone for so many months. But then Frank's voice whispered in my memory, "If you tell anyone, I'll have to leave, and your mother will be all alone again. It will be your fault." "He's fine," I said finally, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. His hand began to move lower, sliding from my shoulder toward my chest, and every alarm bell in my young mind began screaming at once. This was wrong. This was the kind of touching that the few hushed conversations I'd overheard between adults had warned about. The kind of thing that happened to children in cautionary tales whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. "Please don't," I said, my voice small and frightened, but Frank's hand didn't stop. "Shh," he whispered, his lips close to my ear. "This is normal, Patricia. This is what happens in families. This is how men show little girls that they care about them. Your father would have done the same thing if he had lived." The lie was so monstrous, so calculated to destroy my understanding of what love should look like, that it took my breath away. Even at 7, I knew with absolute certainty that my father would never have touched me the way Frank was touching me now. My father's hands had been gentle and safe, offering comfort without taking anything in return. But Frank's mention of my father served its intended purpose. It confused me, made me question my own instincts. If this was something fathers did, if this was normal family behavior, then maybe my fear was wrong. Maybe I was the one who didn't understand. Frank's hand continued its exploration, and I sat frozen on his lap, my mind desperately trying to reconcile the reality of what was happening with everything I had been taught about trusting adults and being a good girl. The physical sensations were confusing and frightening, but even worse was the psychological manipulation, the way Frank made me feel complicit in my own violation, as if I were choosing to participate rather than being coerced. "You're being such a good girl," Frank murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Such a smart, mature little girl, not like other children your age. You understand things they don't you?" I didn't understand anything except that I wanted this to stop, wanted to be anywhere else in the world, wanted my mother to come home and rescue me from this nightmare. But Frank's words were designed to make me feel special, chosen, mature, beyond my years, all the things that might make a child feel proud rather than violated. The sound of a car door slamming in our driveway sent a jolt of terror through both of us. Frank's hands immediately moved away from my body, and he lifted me off his lap so quickly that I stumbled and nearly fell. "Remember," he said urgently, his voice low and threatening, "this is our secret. If you tell anyone at all, I'll have to leave, and your mother will be all alone again. She'll be sad and poor and lonely, and it will be your fault. Do you understand?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face, as Frank quickly pulled on his work shirt and arranged himself casually in his chair. By the time my mother's key turned in the front door, he was reading the newspaper as if nothing had happened, and I was sitting on the opposite end of the sofa, my arms wrapped around my knees, trying to make myself as small as possible. "I'm home," my mother called out cheerfully, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. "How are my two favorite people?" "We're wonderful," Frank replied smoothly, not even looking up from his paper. "Patricia and I had a lovely afternoon getting to know each other better. Didn't we, sweetheart?" My mother looked at me expectantly, waiting for confirmation of Frank's words, and I realized that this was the moment, the choice between truth and complicity, between protection and catastrophe. Frank's threat echoed in my mind. It would be my fault if he left, my fault if my mother was sad again. "Yes," I whispered, the word feeling like poison in my mouth. It was nice. Miss Fitzgerald studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that she could see through my careful facade to the frightened child beneath. She made a note in her folder, then set it aside and leaned forward slightly. "Patricia, I want you to know that my job is to make sure children are safe and protected. Sometimes, grown-ups don't always make the best decisions, even when they think they're doing what's right. If you ever felt unsafe or uncomfortable about anything at all, you could tell me, and I would believe you. The words hung in the air between us like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. For a moment, I felt hope flutter in my chest like a trapped bird, suddenly seeing an open window. Someone was offering to believe me. Someone was suggesting that my feelings mattered, that my safety was important. But alongside the hope came terror. What if Miss Fitzgerald was wrong? What if she didn't really believe me? What if she told Frank what I had said? What if my mother found out and blamed me for destroying her chance at happiness? "I'm safe," I whispered, hating myself for the lie even as the words left my lips. Miss Fitzgerald nodded slowly, but she didn't look convinced. "I'm going to leave my card with Mrs. Coleman," she said, pulling a small white card from her satchel. "If you ever want to talk to me about anything at all, you can ask her to call me. Will you remember that?" I nodded, though I couldn't imagine ever being brave enough to use such an offer. "One more thing, Patricia," Miss Fitzgerald said as our conversation neared its end. "Sometimes children think they're protecting the adults they love by keeping certain secrets, but real protection means making sure everyone in a family is truly safe and happy. Do you understand what I mean?" I understood more than she could possibly know, but understanding and acting were two very different things. I was 8 years old, trapped in a web of fear and manipulation that I didn't have the tools to escape. After Miss Fitzgerald left our school, I found myself thinking about her constantly. Her words replayed in my mind during Frank's nighttime visits to my room, during the moments when his hands wandered where they shouldn't, during the long afternoons when my mother was at work and I was left alone with the man who was systematically destroying my childhood. "You could tell me, and I would believe you." The promise haunted me because it represented everything I wanted but was too afraid to reach for. Miss Fitzgerald had offered me something I had never had before. An adult who seemed to understand that children could be in danger from the very people who were supposed to protect them. But Frank had been too thorough in his psychological manipulation. He had convinced me that I was complicit in what happened between us, that I was somehow responsible for his behavior, that speaking up would destroy not just my mother's happiness but our entire family structure. The shame he had instilled in me was like a poison that made me feel dirty and worthless, undeserving of rescue or protection. 3 weeks after Miss Fitzgerald's visit, Frank cornered me in the basement while my mother was at the grocery store. The basement was his new favorite location for our special time, because the thick stone walls muffled any sounds I might make. He had arranged an old armchair down there, claiming he needed a quiet place to read after work, but I knew its real purpose. "That woman who came to your school," Frank said as he forced me into the chair, his hands already reaching for me with familiar possessiveness. "Did you talk to her about our private family business?" The question terrified me because it meant Frank knew about Miss Fitzgerald's visit, which meant he was monitoring my activities at school more closely than I had realized. "No," I whispered, and it was the truth, though I hated myself for it. "Good girl," Frank said, his approval making me feel sick. "Because that woman doesn't understand our family. She doesn't understand how much your mother needs me, how much you need me. If she knew about our special relationship, she might try to take me away. And then where would you be?" As Frank's abuse continued that afternoon, I found myself thinking about Miss Fitzgerald's words. Real protection means making sure everyone in a family is truly safe and happy. I wasn't safe, and despite my mother's surface happiness, I was beginning to suspect that she wasn't truly happy either. Lately, I had noticed shadows in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, moments when her smile seemed forced and brittle. But recognizing the truth and acting on it were still impossibly far apart for an 8-year-old girl who had been systematically trained to prioritize everyone's needs above her own safety. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the winter wind rattle our windows, I clutched Miss Fitzgerald's card, which I had secretly retrieved from Mrs. Coleman's desk, and whispered her name like a prayer. She represented possibility, hope, the chance for a different kind of life. But for now, she remained just a dream, a distant light in the overwhelming darkness that had become my reality. The card stayed hidden beneath my mattress, waiting for the day when I might finally find the courage to use it. Spring arrived late that year, But when it finally came, it brought with it a series of events that would change everything. I was 8.5 years old, and the abuse had been going on for nearly a year. What had once been occasional violations had become a regular routine, as predictable and inescapable as the sunrise. Frank had grown bolder, more demanding, and increasingly careless about covering his tracks. It was during the first warm week of April that my mother began to notice things she had been too blinded by happiness to see before. "Patricia, honey," she said one morning as I sat at the breakfast table mechanically eating the oatmeal she had placed before me. "You've gotten so thin. Are you feeling all right?" I looked down at myself and realized she was right. My clothes hung loose on my small frame, and my face had taken on the hollow, pinched look of a child carrying too much weight on narrow shoulders. The stress of keeping Frank's secrets, combined with the constant state of fear I lived in, had stolen my appetite and my ability to find joy in simple pleasures. "I'm fine, Mama," I said automatically, but even as the words left my mouth, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. Frank, who was reading his newspaper at the other end of the table, looked up with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Maybe she's just going through a growth spurt," he suggested smoothly. "Children often eat less when they're shooting up like weeds." But I hadn't grown much in the past year. If anything, I seemed to be shrinking into myself, trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that felt increasingly dangerous. Over the next few days, my mother began paying closer attention to my behavior, and what she saw clearly troubled her. She noticed how I flinched whenever Frank touched me, even in what should have been innocent moments. She saw how I avoided being alone with him, always finding excuses to stay close to her when he was in the house. She observed the way I had stopped laughing, stopped playing, stopped being the carefree child I had once been. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon in late April. My mother had gone to visit her sister Beverly, who lived across town and was recovering from a bout of pneumonia. She had planned to be gone for several hours, helping with household chores and preparing meals that Beverly could heat up during the week. Frank and I were alone in the house, a situation that had become routine, but no less terrifying for its familiarity. He wasted no time in making his intentions clear, leading me to the basement where he had created his private sanctuary of violation. But something was different that day. Perhaps it was the way the spring sunlight slanted through the small basement windows, illuminating the dark corners where so much evil had taken place. Perhaps it was the sound of children playing in the neighborhood above, their laughter, a stark contrast to the silence that Frank demanded during our, quote, special time. Or perhaps it was simply that I had reached the limit of what my young mind could endure. As Frank began his familiar routine of manipulation and abuse, something inside me finally snapped. The careful walls I had built around my emotions crumbled, and all the fear, rage, and desperation I had been suppressing for months came flooding out at once. "No!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat with a force that surprised us both. "I don't want to! I don't like this! Stop touching me!" Frank's face darkened with anger, but also something else: panic. In all the months of abuse, I had never fought back, never raised my voice, never done anything but submit to his demands with terrified compliance. "Shut up," he hissed, grabbing my arm with enough force to leave bruises. "You know better than to make noise. What if the neighbors hear?" But I was beyond caring about consequences. 8 months of suppressed terror and rage had found their voice, and nothing Frank could do would silence it. "I'm gonna tell!" I shouted, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying as they left my lips. "I'm going to tell my mama what you do to me. I'm going to tell everyone." Frank's grip tightened on my arm, and for a moment, I saw something in his pale blue eyes that was more frightening than anything I had experienced before. Pure, murderous rage. This was the moment when his carefully constructed facade completely slipped, revealing the monster that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. "If you tell anyone," he said, his voice low and deadly, "I will hurt your mother. Do you understand me? I will make sure something terrible happens to her, and it will be your fault for not keeping our secret." The threat was more specific and more vicious than any he had made before, but instead of cowing me into submission, it had the opposite effect. The idea that Frank might hurt my mother, the woman I was supposedly protecting with my silence, filled me with a fury that burned away my fear. "You're a bad man," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "You're not supposed to touch little girls. You're not supposed to hurt people." My words seemed to echo in the basement, bouncing off the stone walls and growing louder with each repetition. Frank released my arm and stepped back, his face pale with shock and anger. For the first time since the abuse began, I had named what he was doing. I had called it what it was: wrong, harmful, unacceptable. The sound of my screaming had carried beyond the basement, and we both heard the front door slam upstairs. My mother had returned early, drawn back to the house by some instinct she couldn't name, and she had heard enough to know something was terribly wrong. "Patricia?" Her voice called down the basement stairs, filled with concern and growing alarm. "Patricia, are you down there? What's happening?" Frank looked at me with a mixture of desperation and calculation, and I could see him weighing his options. He could try to continue the charade, to convince my mother that everything was fine. He could attempt to discredit my words, to paint me as a confused child making up stories. Or he could run, but as my mother's footsteps began descending the wooden stairs, I made the choice that would change both our lives forever. "Mama!" I cried out, my voice cracking with emotion. "Mama, help me! Frank has been hurting me. He makes me do things I don't want to do." The words tumbled out in a rush, months of suppressed truth finally breaking free like water through a burst dam. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by the quickening of her footsteps on the stairs. When she appeared in the basement doorway, her eyes immediately took in the scene before her. Frank standing over me with obvious guilt written across his face, me huddled in the corner with tears streaming down my cheeks and terror in my eyes. The truth was undeniable, written in every line of our bodies and every expression on our faces. "What?" my mother began, her voice barely a whisper. Then, stronger. "What have you done to my daughter?" Frank tried to recover, to summon the charm and manipulation that had served him so well for so many months. "Ruth, you don't understand. She's confused, making up stories. Children sometimes." "Get away from her," my mother said, her voice carrying a steel I had never heard before. "Get away from my daughter right now." For a moment, the three of us stood frozen in a tableau that seemed to last forever. Then Frank's composure finally cracked completely, and instead of the smooth-talking man who had won my mother's heart, she saw him for what he truly was, a predator cornered and desperate. "You can't prove anything," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of innocence. "Who's going to believe an 8-year-old girl with an overactive imagination? Who's going to take her word over mine?" But my mother was already moving toward me, her arms outstretched, her face filled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that I would remember for the rest of my life. "I believe her," she said simply. "I believe my daughter." And for the first time in 8 months, I finally felt safe. The moment my mother wrapped her arms around me in that basement, everything changed. Not just for me, but for both of us. The careful illusion that had governed our lives for the past year shattered completely, leaving us to navigate the aftermath of a truth too terrible to ignore. Frank's reaction was swift and predictable. Faced with exposure and the loss of control that had defined his relationship with our family, he became the cornered animal he had always been beneath his charming facade. He didn't try to apologize or explain. Instead, he resorted to threats and intimidation one final time. "You'll regret this, Ruth," he snarled as my mother held me protectively against her chest. "No one's going to want a woman with damaged goods for a daughter. You'll be alone again, poorer than before, and it'll be because of the lies this little brat has filled your head with." But my mother had heard enough. The woman who had been so desperate for companionship that she had overlooked the warning signs, who had been so grateful for Frank's attention that she had failed to protect her own child, found a strength I didn't know she possessed. "Get out," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Get out of our house right now and don't ever come back." Frank looked between us, perhaps calculating whether he could salvage the situation, but the determination in my mother's eyes must have convinced him that his time in our home was over. He climbed the basement stairs without another word, and within 20 minutes, we heard his car start and pull away from our driveway forever. The silence that followed his departure was different from any quiet our house had ever known. It wasn't the tense, fearful silence that had characterized so many of Frank's visits, but rather the peaceful stillness that comes after a storm has finally passed. My mother and I sat together on our living room sofa, the same piece of furniture where so much of my abuse had taken place, and began the long process of learning how to talk to each other again. "I'm so sorry, Patricia," my mother whispered, her voice broken with guilt and grief. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you. I failed you in the worst possible way." Her apology meant everything to me, but I had learned enough about adult motivations during my ordeal to understand that healing would require more than words. "You were lonely, Mama," I said, surprising myself with the maturity in my voice. "You missed Daddy, and Frank seemed nice. I understand why you wanted him to stay." We cried together that night, grieving not just for what had been done to me, but for the innocence we had both lost. My mother mourned the relationship she had thought would save us, while I grieved for the childhood that had been stolen and the trust that had been shattered. The next morning, my mother made the most difficult phone call of her life. Miss Fitzgerald's card had been clutched in my hand throughout the night, and together, we decided it was time to use it. Miss Fitzgerald arrived at our house within 2 hours of my mother's call, bringing with her a team of professionals who understood how to handle situations like ours. They were gentle but thorough, asking questions that helped us understand the full scope of what had happened and what needed to happen next. "You were very brave to tell the truth, Patricia," Miss Fitzgerald said as she sat across from me at our kitchen table once again. "And you, Mrs. Foster, did exactly the right thing by believing your daughter and protecting her. Many children aren't as fortunate." The legal proceedings that followed were challenging but necessary. Frank was arrested within a week of his departure from our home, charged with multiple counts of child abuse and sexual assault. The trial was difficult. Frank's lawyer attempted to discredit my testimony by suggesting I was too young to understand what had really happened, but my mother's unwavering support and Miss Fitzgerald's expert testimony helped ensure that justice was served. Frank was sentenced to 15 years in prison, though he would serve only 9 before being released on parole. I learned this fact years later and found that it no longer had the power to terrify me that it once would have. By then, I had rebuilt my life on a foundation of truth and healing, rather than fear and silence. The months following Frank's arrest were not easy for my mother and me. We had to learn how to trust each other again, how to communicate honestly about difficult subjects, how to rebuild our relationship on stronger ground. My mother struggled with tremendous guilt over what had happened under her watch, while I worked to overcome the psychological damage that months of abuse had inflicted. But we were not alone in this process. Miss Fitzgerald connected us with resources we didn't know existed: counselors who specialized in helping families heal from trauma, support groups for mothers whose children had been abused, and programs designed to help young survivors rebuild their sense of safety and self-worth. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to heal. I returned to being a child gradually, rediscovering the capacity for joy and wonder that Frank had tried so hard to destroy. My mother quit her job at the textile factory and used her small savings to start a seamstress business from our home, allowing her to be present for my recovery while still supporting our family. We were poorer than we had been with Frank's income, but we were happier and safer than we had ever been with him in our lives. School became easier as the weight of secrecy lifted from my shoulders. Mrs. Coleman, who had been briefed on our situation by Miss Fitzgerald, made sure I had extra support and understanding as I worked to catch up academically and socially. My classmates never learned the specific details of what had happened, but they noticed that I was more willing to participate in games and conversations, more likely to smile and laugh. As I grew older, I began to understand the broader implications of what I had survived. I learned that child abuse was more common than I had realized, that many children suffered in silence because they didn't have the support system that had ultimately saved me. This knowledge sparked a passion for helping others that would define the rest of my life. I became a teacher, specializing in elementary education, with a particular focus on recognizing the signs of abuse and neglect in young students. Over my 30-year career, I helped identify and protect dozens of children who were facing situations similar to what I had endured. Each time I was able to intervene on a child's behalf, I felt like I was honoring the little girl I had once been and the adults who had refused to let her suffer alone. My mother and I maintained a close relationship until her death in 1989. She never remarried, but she found fulfillment in her work, her community involvement, and, most importantly, in watching me grow into a strong, healthy woman despite the trauma of my childhood. She often told me that my courage in speaking up had saved not just me, but both of us. Miss Fitzgerald became a lifelong friend and mentor. She continued her work with abused children for another 20 years after our case, helping to establish protocols and programs that made it easier for children to report abuse and for families to heal from its aftermath. When she retired, she often said that seeing children like me overcome their trauma and go on to help others was what made all the difficult cases worthwhile. Today, at 81 years old, I can look back on my childhood with a perspective that includes both the darkness and the light. Yes, I survived something that no child should ever endure. But I also experienced the power of truth, the strength that comes from refusing to remain silent, and the healing that is possible when people choose to believe and protect the vulnerable. Frank Harrison died in prison in 1967, 10 years after his release on parole. I felt no satisfaction in learning of his death, but I did feel a profound sense of closure. The man who had tried to define my life through fear and shame had become irrelevant to who I had chosen to become. My story is not unique. Too many children have suffered at the hands of trusted adults. Too many families have been torn apart by secrets and silence. But my story is also one of hope, because it proves that healing is possible, that truth has the power to set us free, and that even the darkest chapters of our lives can become the foundation for something beautiful and meaningful. To any child who might be listening to this story and recognizing something of their own experience in it, I want you to know, you are not alone, you are not to blame, and you deserve to be protected and believed. Find a trusted adult and tell them your truth. It might be scary, but it's the first step toward freedom. To any adult who suspects a child in their life might be suffering abuse, I want you to know, believe them when they try to tell you, even if their words are incomplete or confusing. Look for the signs that go beyond what children can articulate. Be the person who breaks the cycle of silence and secrecy. And to my mother, who has been gone for over 30 years now but whose love and protection still warm my heart, thank you for choosing me when it mattered most. Thank you for believing me when the truth was too terrible to bear. Thank you for showing me that love means protection, not sacrifice. My name is Patricia Lynn Foster, and this is my story of survival, healing, and hope. It took me 81 years to tell it publicly, but I share it now in the belief that truth has the power to light the way for others walking through their own darkness. The little girl who was once too frightened to speak has found her voice at last, and she will not be silenced again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.